What is Pelagianism? Now let's return briefly to my title, The Pelagian Captivity of the Church. What are we talking about? Pelagius was a monk who lived in Britain in the 5th century. He was a contemporary of the greatest theologian of the first millennium of church history, if not of all time, Aurelius Augustine, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. We have heard of St. Augustine, of his great works in theology, of his City of God, of his Confessions, and so on, which remain Christian classics. Augustine, in addition to being a titanic theologian and a prodigious intellect, was also a man of deep spirituality and prayer. In one of his famous prayers, Augustine made a seemingly harmless and innocuous statement in the prayer to God, in which he says, "O God, command what you wouldst, and grant what thou dost command." Now, would that give you apoplexy to hear a prayer like that? Well, it certainly set Pelagius, this British monk, into orbit. When he heard that, he protested vociferously, even appealing to Rome to have this ghastly prayer censored from the pen of Augustine. Here's why. He said, "Are you saying, Augustine, that God has the inherent right to command anything that he so desires from his creatures? Nobody is going to dispute that. God inherently, as the creator of heaven and earth, has the right to impose obligations on his creatures and say, thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that. Command whatever thou would." It's a perfectly legitimate prayer. It's the second part of the prayer that Pelagius abhorred when Augustine said, "And grant what thou dost command." He said, "What are you talking about? If God is just, if God is righteous, and God is holy, and God commands of the creature to do something, certainly that creature must have the power within himself, the moral ability within himself to perform it, or God would never require it in the first place." Now that makes sense, doesn't it? What Pelagius was saying is that moral responsibility always and everywhere implies moral capability, or simply moral ability. So why would we have to pray, "God, grant me, give me the gift of being able to do what you command me to do"? Pelagius saw in the statement a shadow being cast over the integrity of God himself, who would hold people responsible for doing something they cannot do. So in the ensuing debate, Augustine made it clear that in creation, God commanded nothing from Adam or Eve that they were incapable of performing. But once transgression entered and mankind became fallen, God's law was not repealed, nor did God adjust his holy requirements downward to accommodate the weakened fallen condition of his creation. God did punish his creation by visiting upon them the judgment of original sin, so that everyone after Adam and Eve who was born into this world was born already dead in sin. Original sin is not the first sin, it's the result of the first sin. It refers to our inherent corruption by which we are born in sin. And in sin did our mothers conceive us. We are not born in a neutral state of innocence, but we are born in a sinful, fallen condition. Virtually every church in the historic World Council of Churches at some point in their history and in their creedal development articulates some doctrine of original sin. So clear is that to the biblical revelation that it would take a repudiation of the biblical view of mankind to deny original sin altogether. This is precisely what was at issue in the battle between Augustine and Pelagius in the 5th century. Pelagius said there is no such thing as original sin. Adam's sin affected Adam and only Adam. There is no transmission or transfer of guilt or fallenness or corruption to the progeny of Adam and Eve. Everyone is born in the same state of innocence in which Adam was created. And, he said, for a person to live a life of obedience to God, a life of moral perfection, is possible without any help from Jesus or without any help from the grace of God. Pelagian said that grace, and here's the key distinction, facilitates righteousness. What does facilitate mean? I bet it means the same thing as provisionalism, which is what the buzzword is today. Let me continue with the article. It helps. It makes it more facile. It makes it easier, but you don't have to have it. You can be perfect without it. That's what facilitate means. Pelagian further stated that it is not only theoretically possible for some folks to live a perfect life without any assistance from divine grace, but there are in fact people who do it. Augustine said, no, 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 no. We are infected by sin by nature to the very depths and core of our being, so much so that no human being has the moral power to incline himself to cooperate with the grace of God. The human will, as a result of original sin, still has the power to choose, but it is in bondage to its evil desires and inclinations. The condition of fallen humanity is one that Augustine would describe as the inability to not sin. In simple English, what Augustine was saying is that in the fall, man loses his moral ability to do the things of God, and he is held captive by his own evil inclinations. In the 5th century, the church condemned Pelagius as a heretic. Pelagianism was condemned at the Council of Orange, and it was condemned again at the Council of Florence, the Council of Carthage, and also, ironically, at the Council of Trent in the 16th century in the first 3 anathemas of the canons of the 6th session. So consistently throughout church history, the church has roundly and soundly condemned Pelagianism, because Pelagianism denies the fallenness of our nature. It denies the doctrine of original sin. Let's do a little more here. Now, what is called semi-Pelagianism, as the prefix semi suggests, was a somewhat middle ground between full-orbed Augustinianism and full-orbed Pelagianism. Semi-Pelagianism said this: yes, there was a fall. Yes, there is such a thing as original sin. Yes, the constituent nature of humanity has been changed by this state of corruption, and all parts of our humanity have been significantly weakened by the fall, so much so that without the assistance of divine grace, nobody can possibly be redeemed, so that grace is not only helpful, but it's absolutely necessary for salvation. While we are so fallen that we can't be saved without grace, we are not so fallen that we don't have the ability to accept or reject the grace when it's offered to us. The will is weakened but is not enslaved. There remains in the core of our being an island of righteousness that remains untouched by the fall. It's out of that little island of righteousness, that little parcel of goodness that is still intact in the soul or in the will, that is the determinative difference between heaven and hell. It's that little island that must be exercised when God does his 1,000 steps of reaching out to us. But in the final analysis, it's that one step that we take that determines whether we go to heaven or hell, whether we exercise that little righteousness that is in the core of our being or whether we don't. That little island, Augustine wouldn't even recognize as an atoll in the South Pacific. He said it's a mythical island that the will is enslaved and that man is dead in his sin and trespasses. Ironically, the church condemned semi-Pelagianism as vehemently as it had condemned original Pelagianism. Yet by the time you get to the 16th century and you read the Catholic understanding of what happens in salvation, the church basically repudiated what Augustine taught and Aquinas taught as well. The church concluded that there still remains this freedom that is intact in the human will and that man must cooperate with and assent to the prevenient grace that is offered to them by God. If we exercise that will, if we exercise a cooperation with whatever powers we have left, we will be saved. And so in the 16th century, the church re-embraced semi-Pelagianism. At the time of the Reformation, all the reformers agreed on one point: the moral inability of fallen human beings to incline themselves to the things of God. That all people, in order to be saved, are totally dependent, not 99%, but 100% dependent upon the monergistic work of regeneration in order to come to faith, and that faith itself is a gift of God. It's not that we are offered salvation and that we will be born again if we choose to believe, but we can't even believe until God, in His grace and in His mercy, first changes the disposition of our souls through His sovereign work of regeneration. In other words, what the reformers all agreed with was, unless a man is born again, he can't even see the kingdom of God, let alone enter it. Like Jesus says in the 6th chapter of John, no man can come to me unless it is given to him of the Father. That the necessary condition for anybody's faith and anybody's salvation is regeneration.